Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, Sharing Leadership, Practical Lessons and Active Questions. My name is Jean Bell. I direct the Advancing Practice program here at Nonprofit Quarterly, and this webinar is part of that program. We have a number of guests with us today that I'm very excited about, teams from Change Elemental and Fractured Atlas, which are groups that we've been in dialogue with and learning from for multiple years now around leadership generally, and specifically their experiences inside their organizations and guiding others around sharing leadership. So this is a treat, and we welcome them all, and you're going to learn who they are and what's going on with their structures in a moment. Let's get grounded for today's conversation. This is a 90-minute session. Many of our webinars are 60 minutes, but this is 90 minutes, so we hope you have planned for that. There's a lot of wisdom in the room, and we want to hear your questions and poll you on things you're thinking about. So settle in for a good discussion. As always, you'll receive the slides and a recording within a few days, so not to worry there. We've discontinued the chat for groups of this size, but we use the Q&A box, and we welcome your comments and questions as they occur to you, and there will be questions taken throughout the session. And as always, just as the session ends, there's a pop-up feedback form that we really appreciate you completing. It helps me and others and our guest speakers develop their programming. We have a hashtag for today's session. It's Sharing Leadership, so please use that if you're sharing insights and thoughts on social media today. We also have a sponsor. I love it when Harbor Compliance decides to pick a session to be with us on. If you've ever had to do state charitable registrations, I have. I worked at a nonprofit that was all individual giving based across the country, and boy, did I get a baptism by fire in state registration. And then you add online fundraising, which makes it even more confusing. So that's where you go for peace of mind about fundraising compliance, and we thank them for helping support the Advancing Practice program at NPQ. So let me tell you how this conversation is going to go, at least as we plan, with so many great people and your questions. This is a scaffolding, and we'll adjust as we need to. But as I said, we're going to start by hearing from each group, Fractured Atlas and Change Elemental, about who they are, who they brought with them today, and kind of what their current shared leadership model is. As I said in the marketing for this event, we're talking about often co-directorship, and both of these groups do have that, but it's much more than that. From that spills a number of other structures and practices that is really what we mean by sharing leadership. So these structures are dynamic, which will be a theme of today's conversation. So that's why we say we're going to learn their current structures and kind of what's in motion for them. In preparing for today's discussion, we met as a full group and we talked about, well, what are the cross-cutting themes of each other's experiences? The groups are different in terms of their missions. They are both intermediary groups, but they have different missions, different stakeholder groups, and different experiences and trajectories with their shared leadership practice. But we did want to focus on some themes that have been important to their work and see how they show up in each group. We also asked them each to pose their own active questions. What's happening in their models now, and what are they mulling over in terms of strengthening the way they work together? They also each have provided a number of resources, which are live links at the back of this deck that we'll go over. And as I said, throughout, there'll be junctures where we're taking your questions. Some were pre-submitted, I thank you for that, and where we're polling you to find out what your reactions and experiences are. So that's the arc of the conversation. And again, we're going to get into introductions as we introduce each group. And so what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Tim from Fractured Atlas. Actually, I think we'll start with Lauren from Fractured Atlas. And there's our first adjustment. We'll start with Lauren from Fractured Atlas and kick it off for us. Welcome, Lauren.
Thanks, Jean. Hey, everybody. I'm Lauren Ruffin. I'm one of the co-CEOs of Fractured Atlas. Fractured Atlas is an art service organization that's national. We have about 45,000 members across all disciplines. And we primarily help them manage the back end of the business and assist with charitable fundraising. So, Jean, when you were talking about a motorcycle, Jean, when you were talking about, charitable registration, I got hives a little bit. So I totally get it. We're in the midst of all of that. But Tim, you can take it away from here and talk a little bit more about how you and I operate and about our current structure.
Yeah, and it started for us about 4 years ago at Fractured Atlas when the founder and then CEO was transitioning out of the organization into another entity. And we started to ask ourselves, what is the role of the CEO? We in 2013 as an organization committed to becoming an anti-racist, anti-oppressive organization, and we were really looking at hierarchical structures, sharing power, and how we might use this opportunity of a CEO departure into creating a different structure that fit better with how we wanted to operate as an organization, and our values. And so then when the CEO left, we created a 4-person shared non-hierarchical leadership team with a quote unquote no first among equals, which try and explain that to government bureaucracies and banks. And that just creates a bunch of board resolutions about who's this group and how can they make decisions. And no, we don't have a CEO, we have 4. So that was really a lot of work leading up to setting up this. And at the time, we each oversaw one part of the 4 parts of Fractured Atlas. So we sort of were CEO of our own department and co-CEO together. And then as of September 1, 2 of our colleagues have been with us for a number of years, both transitioned into outside consulting firms. And Lauren and I get to continue the adventure together in our current 2-person co-CEO format.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And again, these are both very dynamic models, so there'll be different details to track on, but we'll get into more of what you're experiencing in a moment. So let me turn it over to Natalie to talk a little bit about Change Elemental.
Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie Bomdad. I'm a staff consultant and member of the Chrysalis team at Change Elemental. We work with individuals, organizations, networks, movements to create conditions together so that power and resources can be shared in just ways. And the story of our leadership, our shared leadership evolution, in a lot of ways mirrors that, that work. Currently, we have 2 co-directors, and they're here on the call, Mark and Alyssa. And we've had co-directors for the past several years, and we still do. That was a big transition for our board, or a big decision that the board kind of helped us make several years ago. What is different now is that our co-directors are part of a broader Chrysalis team, which is a group of several other staff who have increasingly taken on more roles and responsibilities that co-directors have historically held on their own. As Chrysalises are wont to do, our Chrysalis is evolving and changing into a hub and a pad model. The hub is now responsible for most big strategic decisions and includes our co-directors and a few other staff. The hub is supported by several different pads that hold leadership functions like finance, HR, which we call human sustainability, external partnerships. And the work of the pads is to really roll their sleeves up and ideate around potential solutions or pathways forward to organizational challenges that we're having or big questions to lift up to the hub. And the pad also is responsible for implementing on some of those decisions that they're making in partnership with the hub.
Excellent. Okay, and I love, in your case, the language, it sounds like, is important, the metaphoric language. And I imagine that has sort of emerged and adapted too over this journey for you. And we can perhaps hear some more about that. Welcome both Alyssa and Mark as well. What I'd like to do now, just that we have the basics, and I already see some questions, so we'll get to those, but let's do a poll now that you all have introduced yourself and find out who's here with us. Anya, would you do the roll poll, please? And we've got options here of executive director, staff, board member, capacity builder, funder, or other. And you can choose as many are appropriate. Many of us wear multiple hats, so you don't have to force yourself into one role here. Okay, so let's begin to see the results here. Okay, can everyone see that on our panel here? Great. So we're about 2/3 staff, some executive and some non-executive, and it's great to see so many board members here, a number of consultants, a few funders. So that's great. And again, people wear multiple hats, so we know that's a mix of multiple roles. Thank you, Anya. And I'd like to go right into another poll, which is around the journey that you're on. So we're curious at this stage, how many of you would identify as being in kind of early exploration, whether it's personally or organizationally, around sharing leadership? Maybe you've begun implementation, or maybe like our panelists, you're already into iterations 2, 3, 10, 12, or something else. So I'll give you a second to locate. All right, and we can start to share the results there. This is great. It's a really nice mix. So we have about half who are in early exploration, who will get a lot of inspiration from this, and then a number of folks who are somewhere on this journey like you are, panelists, with figuring this out and how it might look in their organization. So that's great to see. Thank you all for participating in those. And what I'd like to do now is move to the section of our conversation that's focused on some of the cross-cutting themes that we identified as a group, really coming from your two organizations who have been at this approach or approaching leadership in this way for multiple years. And I want to start with Alyssa, because one of the ideas that came out, and this was, I think, a word that you used in one of our brainstorms, was that this idea of this being fractal, and that we're trying to model inside our organizations what we want for the outside world. And so I want to turn it over to you and just start off with some reactions and thoughts. Why do you use that word when you talk about sharing leadership?
Sure. You know, how I sort of wound up in the world of thinking about leadership as well as exercising it was from my background in education and as a teacher. And, you know, not a revelation to us now, but at 26 years old, you know, realizing that these 18-year-olds were actually these incredible human beings. And what was actually wrong was the systems and structures and adults around them. So I got really interested in adult leadership development for folks who worked with youth and with systems change. And several years later, you know, came across this quote that, you know, the success of any intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. And, you know, it's been talked about a lot. So in many people's work, as well as in what I've experienced. So the world we want out there, if we want to actually be supporting its creation, to be active contributors to bringing that world about, to cultivating that kind of change, we have to be able to create. If we can't create it inside our organizations, like, what makes us think we can do anything in the world? You know? So yeah, really trying to model in a way that is about alignment with our values, that is about cultivating and sharing power differently. That's what we want to see in the world. That's what justice looks like. That's what being in liberating practice looks like. Really tending to mutual well-being, not codependence, but mutual well-being. Requires us to be practicing that ourselves, which means sharing leadership, sharing power, having a different orientation to power and leadership.
Mm-hmm. And if I may, was that something that your organization was born with, that notion, or did that emerge out of the work and the just shifts in thinking, and then you all decided over time that this organization explicitly needs to be a fractal?
I will say yes. And I'm going to pause and invite Mark in, because while I have lots to say about that question, Mark's actually been with this organization for more than 15 years, so can say a lot more about the evolution.
Yeah, it's funny. I would actually have said no, Alyssa. I think
well, it's 4 questions, so that's why.
Yeah, well, the one about, like, has it been part of our DNA? The idea of being a fractal. No, I think that's actually been in the last 5 years that has come to pass. And prior to that, I think you know, we had very much of a typical kind of nonprofit social justice organization sense of ourselves as being like a player somewhere in an ecosystem, but not going down to really looking hard at how our individual internal relationships and other things played out as fractals.
Thank you for that. And I think this is a question, I love what you just said. I think implicit in what you just said as a social justice player, let me make sure I am hearing you right. I heard a little bit of, soft but real self-critique in that we as organizations can be social justice players, perhaps without necessarily doing this internal work or building personal and interpersonal practices that actually lead to social justice. Am I hearing you right?
Yes.
Okay. And I know what a lot of people are thinking, or some people are thinking, is that sounds like it's very time consuming and very confusing. And I bet if I ask Alyssa and Mark and Natalie that, they're going to say yes, right? Is it time consuming and confusing to be a fractal?
Yes, in some ways, but I would also say no, because it means that we don't get ourselves into messes. We're more in alignment with things. And a lot of times when we're not modeling, when we're not being a fractal, we wind up causing harm, or if we're not causing harm, not advancing opportunities in the direction of our vision, And when we are causing harm, we create messes that we then have to spend a lot more time and a lot more energy cleaning up than if we had actually done some of the hard work on the front end.
That gets to an important point. I think a lot of times people say, are we walking our values, as if the only reason to attempt to be a fractal is a values reason and not actually also a practice and execution and relationship issue, right? That it's only because of what we believe as opposed to the effectiveness we could have. So also, not opposed to, in addition to the effectiveness we could have by not causing messes and creating messes. I love that framing. Tim or Lauren, is there anything you'd like to add? I don't know if anyone at Fractured Atlas has ever used the term fractal with respect to your sharing leadership practice. Does it resonate? Did you have different motivations or additional motivations?
I saw Tim and I sort of shaking our heads at that whole conversation around messes. Like, taking the time to get it right on the front end really does resonate. I think that's a conversation we have. I don't think we've used the sort of framing of a fractal though, Tim, have we?
Not that we know of.
Yeah.
Not intentionally, maybe accidentally. Yeah.
Right. But again, I think the basic idea here is that, and it's not a given. I don't know, and I'm going to poll the group in a second and see how people are feeling about this one. That's why I wanted to start with it. Is there a call to action that if we are purportedly working on things in the outside world changing, that we have to be working, we ought to be working, we are working on how those things change inside? So that's one of the premises. We know that that's not the only premise for sharing leadership. There are traditional models in our sector of shared leadership that go back decades, whether it's a medical director and a CEO in a clinic, or an artistic director and a CEO in an arts organization, or a publisher and an editor-in-chief in a journalism organization. I mean, we have lots of models of shared leadership in the sector that I would argue have nothing to do with being a fractal around liberation and justice. They're about sort of dividing work and seeing work as different spheres, right? And I know that may be part of the motivation for some folks, is to make roles more explicit, more sustainable, more logical. And that's part of it too, right? So there's this whole continuum of motivations and reasons. But it feels to me, at least in my work, that this idea is one that more and more people are trying to figure out. What do we want to be inside to authentically work outside? Anya, would you pull up this next poll, please, which asks our participants how they feel about this idea. And forgive me if I've worded this crudely. Hopefully you get from this conversation kind of what I'm getting at, which is, do you feel like there's a mandate to try to create inside what we want to see outside? And we say, yes, I feel that, or yes, in some cases, not necessarily, or no, I don't feel that the organizations are a form that have to take on that charge. So we have a lot of folks that sort of emphatically do feel that way, and a large majority that feel that way in many cases. I'm guessing that might be based on the mission of the organization or sort of its capacity or structures that would be in some cases. But obviously this is a self-selected audience of people that wanted to talk about sharing leadership. But I think it's important to make it explicit inside your organizations.
Yeah, I have some curiosity about the not necessarily, or the cases where it's not, and, you know, want to hijack our direction.
Right. And so it's just again, the point is to make it clear that people are coming at this with different assumptions and expectations, and part of, I think, the work inside organizations, creating the space to make it explicit. Mm-hmm. Let's go on to the second cross-cutting theme. And this is about how relational these models really are, and how dependent they are on the relationships between people, and hopefully how nurturing they are for those relationships as well. And I wonder, Mark, do you want to start us off here with how you express this?
Yeah, and I also want to tie it back to the conversation we just had, which is there's one way of looking at, this is a mandate and somehow like resolving contradictions in our values and our practice, but it's actually a desire. I mean, it's actually like, why would you not want to live in a space of liberation and healing? Why would you not want to work in a place that has that as the thing we're trying to create every day? So, I mean, to me, that's one of the greatest gifts of this. And it goes to the relationship nurturing piece. Mm-hmm. It's like, we actually get to practice every single day. How can we be better humans with each other and create more space and more grace and more equity in the way we are with each other? So it's just fun. I mean, I can't imagine not wanting to have that.
Yeah.
So I know that Jean had asked us to really focus on the how we do things and not so much on the why. So what I just said was kind of a why, and I just want to add one other why of this being relational. Just that it really is the basis, like, of the kind of trust that's needed to really share power. So if the relationships aren't strong, the trust isn't there. If the trust isn't there, then people aren't bringing their ideas, their wholeness, and then the work suffers. So I just want to underscore those as whys. Some of the hows of how we deal with like building greater relationality. One is relationship agreements. And at every level, every time we've had shared power and the dynamics or the structures shift, whether that's somebody takes a sabbatical or there's a change in the team members or we develop a chrysalis, we actually come up with relationship agreements for each of those. And, and they vary some, and a lot of them would be familiar to folks, but let me just read a couple of them. So what happens when we disagree or there's a lack of accountability? We pause, have constructive conversations with each other, and if needed, bring in our coach. So that's a kind of an example of how we would, work on relationality. Another one, when Alyssa took sabbatical and Susan Misser and I were left, and she's a South Asian woman, I'm a white man, we wanted to hold ourselves to more accountability for raising the questions around anti-Black racism specifically. And we've we like to think we've moved somewhat past the place where it's only the Black people in the organization who are raising those issues on a regular basis, but it was an area we wanted to be more accountable. So those kind of relationship things. The other ways we do it, I mentioned co-directors have always had a coach, and we meet every 3 or 4 weeks and talk through issues that are coming up, either between us or between us and other people in the organization. When the chrysalis began, Allison Lynn on our team suggested, let's meet every single day for a half an hour. Anybody who can make it, makes it. And it was an incredibly fast way to start not only outlining our agenda of what we needed to share power around and decisions around, but it also became a place where we could really start to understand who each other was, what we brought, our basic ways of working together. And sometimes the check-ins eat up the entire time and helps build the relationships and the trust. In addition to that, the nurturing, I think, is really a key piece, because as you share power more, then more and more people are holding more risk, more vulnerability, more responsibility. And, they say that, like single CEOs have said, it's lonely at the top. But actually, when you've got shared leadership at the top and good relationships, it's actually incredibly joyful. And you've got, all this experience of having other people have your back, other people kind of holding the load, which brings us to another practical thing we do, which is called Hold the Whole meetings. So we have one Hold the Whole meeting every week of the Chrysalis, where it's a longer period of time. It's like 75 to 90 minutes. And that's where everybody on the Chrysalis gets to kind of really look at what are we holding together as a team and go into depth on some things. So I'm going to stop there. There's more I could say, but let me stop and see if my teammates have anything they want to add.
Natalie, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I think the other piece around relationality and building strong relationships is that it has helped us step into more conflict, and conflict is really good for aligning internal organizational practices with our values and the change that we want to see in the world. And it takes deep relationship and deep courage to be in conflict with folks who've been like co-directors for the past 3 years, especially as someone newly stepping into a leadership role, to know that like I can raise like this challenge or this rub, and we can disagree about it, but we're going to still be good, and we can still move forward the other pieces of the work that need to move forward, and we're not carrying that with us, like in our bodies and into other things.
Yeah. Those are all extremely important points. And just to kind of recap what I heard you all say, are you hearing me all right? I know we've had some sound issues. Okay. Relationship agreements are formed and made explicit. Co-directors and maybe others have access to coaching. You tried, and I don't know if you're still using, daily kind of stand-ups, we might call them, these optional opt-in short touching base meetings. You have longer, quote, hold the whole meetings on a weekly basis, and you're making room for conflict and building relationship in that way too. It's not just a culture of niceness in these relationships. So those are all hugely important. My understanding is that none of these are forced relationships. These are relationships that people agreed to. Am I right about that? Nobody said you two now either become co-directors or we don't have a job for you or something like that, right?
No, and we made proposals to folks that, we're thinking about this. What do you think about it, right? And so some of that happened. Also, some other folks stepped forward and said, I really want to learn more about this area of work. And for some folks, they're into it and they love being in that area of work and are stepping even farther into it. And for other folks, they're like, you know what? I tried that. I never want to do that again.
Right.
So that's happening. And the only other practical how piece I wanted to add, Jean, is really tending to folks' professional development, both in a formal way, like folks have access to that, and not just the co-directors, but like across our team. And then the other piece is when we first shifted from having a model of a single, executive director, a single positional leader, to co-directors, we were really clear that it wasn't just shifting the positional structure of the top, the most power, but shifting toward a culture of shared leadership, which meant reimagining supervision. And we started defining supervision as how we grow and support each other's superpowers in service of our shared vision. so that in all of our conversations, when we're learning about how to do feedback, and we talk about, constructive or constructive tensions and like generative tensions, generative conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that piece is key as well.
Yeah, and we're going to keep talking about this. We have a whole slide on it about how once we start to hold power differently, our traditional structures come into question, and supervision is one of them. They just start to need to be reimagined because power isn't being held over, which is how most of our systems instructions are designed to work, right? So supervision being one of any number of processes that get re-examined, right, in this context.
And that doesn't mean we figured it all out.
No.
We still mess up. We'll probably mess up tomorrow.
Right. Okay. I'm going to move us along because we have a lot of questions, and I want to get through these 4 themes and then really do some Q&A about the things that you've raised. So let me go to Natalie, I believe, is up on this other cross-cutting theme, which is how dynamic you all have experienced these structures to be: experimental, iterative, and also resilient. Do you want to start us off, and then we'll get some comments from Fractured Atlas on that as well?
Sure. Yeah, when Alyssa mentioned earlier the difference between codependence and interdependence, I was thinking about like this metaphor of like leadership being like holding like this bowling ball, and sometimes you might have like a personal crisis and you might like let the ball go. And in like the co-director model, that means that like someone's holding like your ball and their ball. Whereas like in like this more dynamic model where there's more interconnection, more people involved, like dropping a bowling ball means that there are like 5 other hands that can like shoulder that weight. And so we're all kind of stretching and no one's breaking, as no one's really like breaking under that weight. And I think right now, like given COVID, like we've all had a lot of personal crises. In those moments, we have been able to like step back and know that several people are stepping up and not feeling the weight of that guilt. And, that happened, a couple of months ago when I was preparing for a board meeting and then couldn't make it. I knew that 5 other folks had all been co-creating this agenda together, and could step up in that space. Mm-hmm. The other practical thing that I would say about like this dynamic structure is that we've set shorter time horizons and like milestones to lift up and reevaluate. And so the question of like, can we be on the chrysalis for 5 months is really different than will you take this role on chrysalis in perpetuity? And so it's given people the opportunity to try, especially people who like me who are newer to leadership in this way, the opportunity to try on different roles with support, and without like an eternal commitment, and in a way that's like lowered the stakes, and allowed for a lot of flexibility and a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, that reminds me of how big an insight it was when I was trying holacracy, the distinction between a position and a role, right? And we've so packed job descriptions with these permanent responsibilities in traditional frames, as opposed to what I hear you saying is I can step into a role for 3 months and see if in fact I thrive in it, or no, it was too much, or it doesn't tap my strengths, and I don't have to change my job description right that second necessarily to activate that role. That's great. Tim, is there something you would add around the dynamism of these models now that you've lived through, as you said in your introduction, multiple iterations?
Yeah, I think as a how, attaching the word experiment to this frees you to make those mistakes, to be like, yeah, that didn't work, so let's back up and go a different way. Or like that's, rather than saying like we have to get it right the first time. How is this 4-person team working with the board? How's the board communicate with them? To just in any ways we work as organizations. As we were starting this journey, realized like, so we adopted this when we were a 40-person organization, $30 million budget. And, most organizations, most nonprofits have a structure to run their organizations that was built for the military and massive corporations. And most organizations have 10 people. And so like, why do we have this strict hierarchical structure? We're like 10 people. We could fit in a small conference room around a table and talk about this. But yeah, we need to have all these different processes and structures. And it was really freeing for us to say, like, let's just like do something that we think fits us and how we want to work. That's fun, that's supportive. When we end up in places like global pandemics, we have other people who are sharing the challenge with us, and then continue to iterate off of that. We've mainly been talking about our organizations. For Fractured Atlas, we mainly focus on shared leadership at the top, not as one of my friends who sort of consults in this space calls it leaderful organizations. How can we build leadership and share power throughout the organization? And for us at Fractured Atlas, that's been one of the things we've been looking at. Your sort of shared CEOs work well, but then how does this work in other teams and across the organization? And I know we be touching on this a little bit later about how do you seed or seed. I know you say that doesn't matter. You can't see the spelling change in my mind when I say those two words. So CEDE and SEED, power throughout the organizations. And so I feel like this is what's exciting, right? We have the opportunity to create places where we want to work and that fit us in the times in which we're living in our missions, and sort of just tearing stuff apart and being like, well, that's not what we want. Is why it's exciting for us to have this opportunity. And then you see it throughout the organization, other ways of creating different ways of working, like we all have been doing since March of this year. Like, how can we create other ways of connecting as human beings to serve those who we serve when we can't all be in the same place, or so I think that for us, the dynamism is really exciting. It's also, as we'll touch on later, it's really fucking exhausting. Even with the sharedness that's there, it can be really tiring. And sorry, I should have... Also, I dropped the F-bomb.
I'm really proud of you, Tim. I thought I'd be the first one. I'm so proud.
I know, Lauren. I saw you looking at me, and all of a sudden, yeah, I did it. I should point out that research shows people who curse are more likely telling you the truth. But yeah, so there.
Okay. Well, and I mean, to be fair, yes, it's tiring. And I did a little bit of research on co-directors maybe 5 years ago. And one of the big takeaways is it's not less work. What I hear you saying and what Natalie's saying is it's not less work, but it's not lonely work. It's more collaborative work. It's more resilient work. It's more joyful work. So it's if anyone thought this was going to be easy or like reduce your hours or something, this is the wrong webinar for that. We're trying to make the work richer and more reflective of how we want to be, right? In most cases, it's not less work unless you're literally taking a job and cutting it in half, but that's not typically what we mean by sharing leadership, right? Okay, let's move to Lauren. And this is a big bucket, and it is going to encompass a number of the questions that we already have. And I remember in our brainstorming, Lauren, that you kind of started off with saying, this goes right at even our charity identity and some of the ways we think about nonprofits. We end up that gets surfaced as well. So why don't you start us off with how you think of sharing leadership in your organization has been pushing on the status quo?
Yeah, I mean, I'd start by saying, I've been with Fractured Atlas for 4.5 years. It's the longest I've been anywhere. I'm an entrepreneurial person who needs a lot of variety and a lot of ambiguity. And Fractured Atlas's culture has always been one that is iterative and experimental and really innovative and risk tolerant. And that goes with sort of the way that our board approached leaning into a shared leadership model when we had a founder transition. The conversations were really, really generative. There were questions that were designed to push us and push our thinking to make it the most, I think, strong and nimble, configuration of adults leading an organization as possible. But, for us, it's, that sort of, I think the organization has always been one that challenged the status quo. From becoming, sort of quickly using technology to scale and becoming an organization that's primarily supported by our own work as opposed to donations. So we have a history of doing that. One of the things that, what we've been thinking about a lot is how do we take that push even further to thinking about what does it mean for people to work at Fractured Atlas? And so, to that question we're getting to around seating power versus seating power, I would also say that some of the things that we've been open to are how do we encourage our staff to be entrepreneurial? I have a business, Tim and I have a podcast and a brand that we work on. And all of that's related to our work at Fractured Atlas and enhances and augments that work, but it's not work that can necessarily fit squarely within our mission of being an arts service organization. And so, as we push that is how can your nonprofit become a springboard for whatever its employees want to do? How do you really use an accelerator incubator approach there to begin to shift the form of what a nonprofit is, which for some organizations is we value long tenure. We value people doing the same things repetitively over and over again. We love people who work in departments and teams and groups. So really beginning to flex outside of that, I think has been really important to us. With regard to governance, the question we get probably more than any other is around accountability and decision-making. That's something our board spent a fair amount of time, granularly, who do we email for this thing? And we were like, send it to the four of us and we'll figure it out and get you an answer probably quicker than we would if you were emailing one of us. So I think those questions around decision-making and, the real practical, who's responsible for this thing? Oddly enough, you get a lot of insight into people's personal relationships when they're asking questions around decision-making. And I'm like, well, I spend as much time with Tim and with my three, we were a 4-person with my 3 colleagues as I do with my wife. And we're able to make decisions as a 2-person team. So, and as a family, so why couldn't we do this within this organization? And the folks who sort of have the hardest time getting over that hump, you learn a lot about their interpersonal relationships, which has always been super interesting to me. Right now, we're really playing around with compensation. And this is, Tim and I have a fair amount of healthy conflict around compensation openly. Because, we have a fixed tier compensation model, which I push against a fair amount because I really think people should be compensated for the value of their labor. And that can be really rigid sometimes. But we're also thinking about what could it look like if we just threw our entire personnel budget in a pot and split it against everybody in the organization. So the entire organization is making the same thing. What does that say about the value of our labor at various levels? And not just the value, externally, but internally, do we value, the person who's supposedly doing, we don't have a custodian, but how would we value a custodian's work at the same level of a CEO, especially in a time when we're thinking about, cleanliness is really important in office environments. So whose work is more valuable? So we're playing around a lot with sort of, ideas around compensation. In addition to not just, the monetary compensation, but how are we spreading power throughout the organization, giving people the freedom to make decisions? Because Tim you can sort of cite research off the top of his head about how long a salary bump gets you in terms of employee morale. It's not very far, maybe 1 or 2 pay periods. So what are the other ancillary things that go along with compensation that are thinking outside the box to be able to make people happy? And then to what Tim's point around identity. So many organizations are wrapped up in the ego of a founder or the ego of an executive director or CEO, and they become the face of an organization. Their ideas carry more weight. But, for us, it really is, how does it look like to openly have, a cisgender white guy and a queer Black female identifying person working together in partnership? And how does that partnership begin to change how the organization, which, Fractured Atlas has historically been, a single young tech guy founder, how does that transition to an entirely new way of working, actually shift the identity of the organization, shift the way we see our mission, shift our risk tolerance, and what we think are acceptable norms and behaviors within the organization?
Thank you. That was hugely helpful insight into a number of these issues. And I really think this question of identity, and you're making a connection to, as we see turnover and transition generationally in the sector from founders and longtime single executives, how much this has an opportunity or poses an opportunity to shift organizational identity, and sort of co-ownership is almost what I hear you saying. I wonder, Mark, or anyone from your team, I know you've been there the longest, Mark, do you want to address the question of governance and how governance is unfolding as you continue to evolve your model?
Yeah, briefly, and maybe even prefiguring a conversation we're going to be having with our governance team about this. So they may be hearing it for the first time if they're on the call. But when we start sharing power differently internally, the board's been, we actually call it a governance team because we have shifted over the last many years, a certain level of trust that the board is now, very comfortable with us leading in areas that they used to think were theirs. And which, by legal rights, some of them are theirs, but there's a whole lot of stuff that's just history, it's just the way it's been done. So we're really inviting the board into kind of this reimagination of power sharing in a number of different ways. So we have there's a board leadership reconfiguration committee that we've been meeting with for over a year to keeping them really apprised of what's happening in the internal shared leadership stuff. And the more we've been looking at that, the more the board has gotten really interested in, well, first of all, we've got an incredible board that is already experimenting with power sharing in their own worlds, many of them. So sometimes we get, great information from them about how to be. But like we're in this funny space of how much do we codify these changed roles and risk killing it by actually like stabilizing it and writing it down, and how much do we just kind of ride this wave of goodwill and experimentation that seems to be working really well and evolving on its own. So I don't know if that's a very coherent answer, but I would say it's an experiment. It is always in flux. We're moving more and more towards challenging the traditional role, and the board seems to like that too. I mean, they love to come to meetings and be in conversation about these things. So it's getting to be a rich two-way street.
Yeah, and this is so interesting because, as you all know, I mean, there's been writing that I would consider academic writing, mainstream writing, if you will, about what governance really is and how external to the boardroom it really is, right? And so this is not a radical idea that the boards are not in charge of governing, right? That the practice of governance, of setting direction, expressing mission, ambassadoring to the community, building relationships, managing risk. These are things that are done by staff, board, major donors who are very involved stakeholders, et cetera, right? So we already know as a sector that governance is not the sole proprietary, area of the board. And yet what I find is that when we get into conversations like this that feel a little more radical, people start to kind of close in again and pretend they don't know that, right? And so I think it's really helpful that what you're saying is involve the board in this. There isn't a board version of this and a staff version of this. There may be some different, very specific roles, of course, but they're both invested in governance and making sure the organization is setting direction and expressing its mission. And they always have been,
Well, if anyone's interested in the, Alyssa, go ahead.
Go, Tim.
Sorry. On our site, workshouldn'tsuck.co is a link at the end of the webinar, but we have an entire section about our shared leadership journey that includes 4 pieces that were written by our board members about this. And there's also a podcast where we interview the board chair and board vice chair at the time that we started this experiment. So for anyone who's really interested in diving deeper into that, there's a couple of pieces from the board perspective and active questions that they have about this role and how it intersects with their governance role.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And again, I think one of the practical things I hear you both saying is don't do this without your board. Don't get way ahead of your board, right? And I heard Mark saying that there's a committee called the
A leadership reconfiguration committee.
Yeah, that leadership that they're involved in, right? So obviously you have to attract at least some people to your board who want to be experimental and iterative, right? If this is going to be a way of being, you can't have such radically different cultures in the two spaces probably to do this. You have to have some people who are genuinely interested in being a fractal or being part of a fractal. But once you have that, then what we're saying is there can be this joint learning space, and really that there has to be. In order for this to work from a governance perspective. Am I overstating that?
I think by example, when we first made the shift from a single executive director to co-directors, it was about a 2-year process. And it required some board members to leave. It required some board members to come on and start advocating for the value of that. It was not a short or quick process, but I think it needed to be done in a way that did build ownership of the eventual solution.
Mm-hmm. And that gets to that first question that you were honest about is this in your DNA? And that was an expression of, for some folks, it wasn't, right? And so if there was enough momentum that being a fractal was going to be part and parcel of this work, then there will be some transition, right?
Yeah, a quote from a no longer board member was, "I want one ass to fry."
Oh dear. That would be a different mindset. Yeah. That's going to be a tough one to incorporate. We could try to put our arms around as wide as we can, but that's going to be a tough one to incorporate. Okay, so let's shift now. So those were those cross-cutting themes that I think, especially this last one, got into a lot of some of the practical questions. And yes, sharing power challenges power structures. There's no doubt about that. And so what these groups have both done is say, okay, let's get people who want to experiment in that, who want to be accountable, who want to be explicit about their relationships and accountabilities, and begin to experiment with the model. What I want to do now is pose a question that was pre-submitted from the audience, but is very concurrent with some of the questions I see here already in our Q&A box. And this question is about getting funder buy-in. So we've talked about boards and their resistance or excitement or both about sharing power. So let's look at this question. So the question is, my organization is currently designing a co-leadership model and will have our co-CEO on board early next year. And they're struggling with how to communicate that to their funders. And we've all had this experience, especially if you have foundation funders, I would say in particular, who have opinions about organizational design and capacity, that they're worried and they're expressing that worry for the organization. And I'm curious just to get a reaction. We'll go back to you, Mark, for a second, and then open it up to others. How have you communicated this to funders? Have you experienced resistance or concern?
I have to say not much, actually, from funders. Alyssa, you may have had different experiences of that, being the first. I mean, I wasn't a co-director initially, but it raises more questions for me. Which is, what's the nature of the relationship with the funders that they wouldn't understand the values base for which you were doing that, and could open the door to more conversation about, do we actually share values around this, and a chance to bring them along in your thinking. I think it also, there may be roles for the board in this, in terms of talking with funders. And also, anybody that's asking that question now, hasn't been keeping up with a lot of what's been happening. It's like, I'd be saying, well, there's actually a lot written out there already now about this. And here are some things you can read also. And they could also talk to co-directors where it's actually working, or to board members in organizations, or funders who are literally falling all over themselves to try to support and publicize new models of shared leadership. So they could talk within their own group. So I think there's lots of different avenues there. But the sharing of core values would be, to me, the most important question to be raised by this.
What would you add, Alyssa?
It's complex. So one aspect of it is that our budget is probably, I don't know, I don't want to give percentages, but I'll just say a large chunk of it is actually earned income. And that earned income, though, from a lot of folks are foundations, but they're hiring us as contractors to actually do a piece of work as opposed to giving us a grant. We do also have grants to do specific pieces of programmatic work. So our relationship to funders is a little different. We're not as dependent on grants in the ways a lot of other nonprofits are. And it was challenging, and I don't think just because we were sharing leadership, Susan and I, but because we were also two out queer women of color. And with many of our funders, that didn't matter. And I could feel resistance trying to move into funding relationships for the organization that were previously held by a white person. And I can remember one funder in particular who I described what we were going to do next and why and the principles and what we had learned from our client base, many of whom this funder also funded. And she just kept saying, I don't get it, I don't get it, I don't get it, I don't get it. So I sent her a link to a webinar that Mark had done for a client explaining a concept that used literally the same language I had done, that I had used, and she got it, right? So there were those kinds of challenges as well. And then I realized I've been talking for a minute, but just one more thing.
Please.
With that, it's also made it easier in some ways because, Mark sometimes will say, well, would it be more helpful for me to have a conversation with this person? Or someone else might say that, right? In the organization. So we can really think about, it's like we're all, if you think about the difference between a representative or a delegate and a trustee, it's like we're all trustees. We're all trusted to be change elemental in the world, as opposed to represent and parrot something. Right? Not just a single person in a single role who has to accomplish these things or be in these relationships. And there are differences between Susan and I in the way we interact and the way we talk about and approach work. So there were some funders that were like, Susan worked for TCC Group for a long time. She can speak that language. Like, those are Susan's funders' relationships. And there were some that were mine, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate you framing that as an advantage too. It allows you to do more relationship-specific fundraising, that people are empowered to have those relationships directly where they're going to be most resonant.
And now Natalie is developing a lot of those relationships too.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I think this is a really good area of exploration, and it's, so much of our interactions with funders who have opinions about what we do internally, whether, it has to do with owning our own story. And I love the practical tips that you gave, both of you, about owning that story, but also delivering it as effectively as you can. Let's go to another question. I'm going to go to Tim. This was a two-part question from a participant. What are some recommendations for phasing sharing leadership in? If you were to look back on it and think about something that you might adopt earlier rather than later that can kind of set the stage, what might you point to? Does anything come up for you on that first part?
I think part of it is starting to talk about what is the role of a leader? What is the role of the CEO? How do we make decisions in this organization? Who's in the room? What's that process look like? How might we, again, the questions, what if and how might we? What if we didn't have a CEO? How might we go about doing that? Again, if we didn't have a conference room, how might we connect as community? If we couldn't access our check stock, how might we move money? All the questions people have been thinking about a lot since COVID arrived, and I think asking those questions, you start to develop what is that thing that we're trying to do. And at the same time, I think it's come up time and again in the comments already. It's really important to look at those sort of characteristics of quote unquote high performing teams. We've talked about trust already. We've talked about psychological safety, healthy conflict, the ability to engage in healthy conflict, healthy egos, not big egos, all of the things that support teams to work. Because if those are absent, God help you, because trying to share leadership, that's going to be a mess. And so how do you cultivate that in your organization? It will be the foundation, will be foundational for this work. And then one practical thing I think early in, when we started to think about this, I pulled together a lot of research that existed around shared or distributed leadership. All of the stuff that I sort of read and looked at and watched is in a blog post on Work Shouldn't Suck. And one of the pieces that came up is shared leadership works best when the Venn diagrams of areas of expertise don't overlap a lot. So Jean, you already said like artistic director and executive director. Those are pretty distinct things. In sharing leadership, that's not a lot of overlap. But if you have program director 1, program director 2, those are almost like directly overlapping circles. And so questioning like, how might we divide work and what does that look like so we can share it, but that we're not being duplicative, I think is an interesting way to start to see how this can show up in your organization in a way that fits you and not necessarily Change Elemental or Fractured Atlas or countless other organizations who are experimenting with this framework.
Thank you very much. I love starting with decision making and then looking at those functions and strengths of people where it's funny, I'm in a situation right now where I'm thinking about recommending a shared leadership model because there's so much talent and I don't want to lose it. That's another reason is, I think when you have talent that is either going to leave because it can't move anywhere, right? How can you explore shifting functions a little bit? So what I hear you saying is examine the decision-making processes and then really look at the functions and where there are gaps and overlaps and how you might structure that work specific to what's going on at your organization. And that gets to the second question. Let's see, where am I going? I'm going to stay with you, Tim, for a second, but let's add other people too. The question is around structuring in a way that's clear to people. And I'm sure the people that are maybe a little more resistant to this even on our call today are thinking, how do you explain this to anybody? What's the decision tree? What's the org chart? How do you orient a new staff person to where they should go? Are org charts and those kinds of tools less helpful? What have you done to actually make this clear or clear for now to the people on your teams?
I liked, I think Mark, you said like, don't codify this because then it can't be flexible in what you need. I think part of it is hiring for people who have a comfort level with ambiguity and constant change. If that is not, there are plenty of high performing people, however you define high performing, who do not work well in environments that there's constant change and a lot of ambiguity. So figuring out if you have those team members who can like, all right, we're not sure where exactly we're going to land, but we're going in that direction, and we can adjust along the way. For us, some of the practical things is we just have an email address. I'm not going to say it out loud because I think maybe people could email out externally, but there's an email address that our board and staff can email that gets to the co-CEOs. And then we can take it from there. There's also the difference between like domain expertise, like software engineering. People aren't going to come to me for the question about software engineering. They might, but the next time they won't, because I'm like, I don't know. I don't know that. But if you have a question about operations or finance or people, that would have been me. Lauren, external relations, our former colleague Pallavi, programs. And so there's some of that there. So it just sort of naturally occurs. Also, I love the idea of, a lot of people might not be comfortable going to the CEO for something, but when there's four different people, you might be more comfortable. Now there's 4 different people that you could go to and talk to. So having more opportunities for staff to engage with those serving this function, I think is really important. And so that's what I think. Well, I'll put a period about 4 words back. Period.
Great. Does anyone on the Change Elemental team want to share any practical tips for expressing the current structure to people in a way that's clarifying?
Sure. I can start us off. We use a lot of actually metaphor and imagery,
Mhm.
quite honestly, and it's a part of one of our, I don't know, tenets, if you will, of what we think is necessary for making change in the world, which is multiple ways of knowing, right? So, how do we bring in imagery and metaphor and things like that to understand structure? So, when we were moving from co-directors uh, to co-directors within a chrysalis structure, we were talking about chrysalis to butterfly, right? And we had images and we drew up things and we did share those images but shared them with the kind of a stance I try to have a lot. I don't know if Mark and Nat can tell if it really works, can tell you that, but of like presenting things strongly, but holding them lightly, right? I have lots of strong opinions, but I actually hold them pretty lightly. So then we realized, you know what? Butterfly means like we've gotten to a destination and that's it. And we're a butterfly and then we die. And that's not what we want. So that's why we started changing. And we're in this process now of moving to a hub and pad structure. And the pads we're actually thinking of as lily pads. And there are STEM liaisons. So the lily pads that are dealing with mostly internal stuff, even though there's lots of, overlap, there's an internal STEM liaison who is on the hub. Same for external, right? And then we also think of our governance team as mycelium, as a part of the mycelium, right? If you bring an ecosystem perspective. And the kind of mycelium that's good, not the parasitic kind. But
there are these risks with imagery. You have to be very specific with these metaphors.
Yes, but the board is getting it. Like they're working with that. They're actually reading about healthy mycelium and like thinking about what does that mean for our role and our relationship with the staff and our relationship with the wider field and all of that kind of stuff. And it gives staff the opportunity to play with things who actually may not be in client spaces, may not be thinking about these concepts of shared leadership. So instead of trying to explain it to them with theory, we use images and metaphors from nature, and it brings a way for them to bring their brilliance and extreme wisdom from the roles they do have in the organization into impacting and giving feedback on the structure and participating in the structure.
I love that. I mean, I just think that's such good guidance for any practice, let alone only sharing leadership. We're so cerebral and codifying in some pretty dry language of leadership. And we know this, that the next generation, diverse leaders, are not resonating with those terms and structures. They're not, and so it is absolutely values, but it's also, this isn't going to work. It's not going to inspire people to want to lead, to just join and recreate these same systems that have created inadvertent oppression, at best, in a lot of organizations. Alyssa, were you going to say something else?
Yeah, I just wanted a reminder. You talked about age, and as well you used the term diverse. When we're on that call 5 years ago that you hosted around, I'm remembering that it was a revelation to all of us that of all the pairs or trios, groups of folks on the call, there was only one person over 50. There were only 2 white people who were in these shared leadership structures. And it was pretty much like folks of color, under 50, I'd say about 2/3 of whom were queer, who were trying these things 5 years ago, and that's not necessarily reflected on this call, but it's not working for a whole lot of people. So I think as we move more towards justice and liberation and think about how we don't throw all of the babies out with the bathwater, right? There's some useful things we want to keep from the practices we have. but how do we expand and grow and like think differently and embrace different ways of being that aren't necessarily new? They just might be new to some of us.
That's right.
Yeah.
Appreciate that a lot. Okay, Anya, I'm ready for that poll. I want to hear what our participants are thinking about in terms of what excites them most about potential impacts of sharing leadership in our sector. And I won't know if you did this, but try to pick two. But some of the things that we thought about were advancing equity for our staff, making work more joyful, or as Tim likes to say, making it not suck. Challenging these structures and mindsets of the sector that just are stale for a lot of people, attracting more diverse leaders, being part of reimagining how power is defined and used, deepening our impact in our communities where our ways of being will resonate more. Or does it excite you to be part of testing and creating new organizational models? And of course, there are many other things, but I'm curious just to take the temperature of what excites our participants. I don't know how you pick two of those things, so that was a silly piece of guidance, but I'm not going to worry about which one won. They're all good things. But let's see, Anya, what people said. Ooh, I love that. I just said I wasn't going to see who won, and then I oohed and awed over who won, so that was a quick turnaround. But being part of reimagining how power is defined and used, I mean, that's really fundamental to this work. Even being conscious of power and how it's used, I think is a step forward in our organizational work. So great, thank you for sharing that, Anya. So let's move now to the questions that you're actively grappling with. And Lauren, I'd like to start with you. The question was, at Fractured Atlas, what's top of mind in where you are in your iteration?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, this question around, ceding power versus ceding power, which came up, Tim and I regularly meet with some of our colleagues to talk about things we might want to write about or talk about on our podcast or whatever. And we had a clarification on a transcript that was, when we said cede, did we mean SEED or CEDE? We were like, oh shit, it could be either one and both. For us, and I spend a fair amount of, half of my life at Fractured Atlas in the nonprofit sector, the other half of my life running a cooperative of artists. I keep sort of pushing us to think about what does it look like to move towards a model that is democratically governed, which is not always the fastest way to move, but you often do get to better results. Going back to that question that someone posed from their funder, I mean, I can't think of deliberative bodies that move much slower than foundation board. I mean, what a rich question, right? Nonprofit boards are the second slowest, and then you get to everybody else. So is speed really the goal, or is coming to a decision that's really important and that does distribute power throughout the organization? And we've started to see that happening. I think, moving from our 4-person team to our 2-person team, where we have staff members who, are, as much as I hate the hierarchy that's there, that are sort of in the sort of bottom portion of folks with autonomy in the organization. As we're intentional about giving them opportunities to come up with their own solutions to things they've excavated, unearthed in terms of their process, their workflow, and their sort of way of working, they're coming to really, really great questions. I mean, really, really great solutions that are solutions that Tim and I couldn't have come up with. And, in the process of them forming their own networks and ways of organizing, that becomes a stronger, more resilient organization. Absolutely 100%. So, for us, it's about modeling, the respectful conflict that Tim and I have as people who trust and love each other deeply. I hope, Tim, don't stop me now because we're in public and this is being recorded. But, how are we modeling that for everybody on staff, right? Did you want me to jump into the second question or?
Yeah, I think that's where we are time-wise. And so that was perfect, giving us a sense of what it means. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think leadership models, Tim, I think you find shared leadership a little bit more exhausting than I do, maybe. But I'm someone who, you know, I love problems. And I think, Tim, you feel it a little bit differently than I do.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's far better than being a single CEO. Having been in that role, you know, to have other people there who deeply understand the challenges that you're wrestling with, and especially now. I mean, God, you know, global pandemic, social unrest, revolution, contested election, all of the things we're bringing with us to work, to have someone else, other people to help you wrestle with this and to as we talked about earlier, help with the burden, help with the load as it shifts around. It is exhausting. One of our colleagues, Pallavi Sharma, who was one of our previous co-CEOs, said, in the same way that I find it uplifting and helpful to have other people who share that load, she pointed out, and we also know each other's challenges deeply now. And so when I go to bed at night, I'm just not worrying about like my things in sort of my department. I'm worrying about engineering. I'm worrying about external relations. I'm worrying about finance or people or operations. And so so there's a double-edged sword here that we hold. And I think that's what we wrestle with. We had to help with the board. We published this as well, how we were going to evaluate our 4-person shared non-hierarchical leadership team, because part of the board's responsibility is to evaluate the CEO. And so we created this structure, had an outside person help us with this. And one of the things that they came back with was like 31 pieces about this structure. And one of them was shared leadership is exhausting. And we're like, no shit. It's like, yes. And at the same point, there's incredible benefits to it. And I would not trade shared leadership for a single CEO model, having lived with this and see the benefits that come from it. I'm curious, at Change Elemental, do you feel the same exhaustion? Or is this just a Fractured Atlas thing?
Natalie, do you want to jump in on that? Do you guys kind of even jokingly say, woo, this is a lot to hold, or no, not really?
I think sometimes it feels like a lot when we're like working through something and then we reap the benefits of the hard work and it feels really good. You know, I think our hardest moments are when we are working through a decision and there are 5 people weighing in. And we're in a moment of so many people who are part of the decision. It's actually happening because there's like a values-based tension that's coming up. And my internet's unstable, but hopefully, and that's what sometimes feels exhausting and like hard work, like when we're parsing through like a values misalignment and trying to figure out how do we work around it, or hold the tension between legal structures that we are accountable to and liberatory structures that we are moving towards. And that feels hard, and it feels hard with 5 people, but I think it'd also feel hard just doing that by myself or doing it with 2 people.
Yeah. I mean, like, people are exhausting, like, and we have to operate with people. So I don't know that this is more or less exhausting than running. You know, it feels better. At least I know someone else is exhausted with me instead of sort of myself wandering through the desert on my own, you know?
Also have to ask the question, like, exhausting for who? So it's not as if there wasn't exhaustion for people that were excluded from leadership and opportunity before, and the emotional labor they put into trying to, make a space. And so I think you also just have to ask, exhausting for who and at what levels.
I find having 5, like the chrysalis and co-directorship, is way less exhausting than just a co-directorship. Like, my life has changed dramatically in the last year and I love it.
Thank you for that specificity, because a number of our questions have been like, as you push shared leadership beyond co-directorship, does it get, more or less? And what you're saying is, again, of course you have to come up with the formats, but you feel less pressure, less isolation. Okay, so we have just about 3 minutes here. So we're starting here with Natalie. So if you could be fairly succinct, but give us a sense of what this first active question means at Change Elemental.
Yeah, and the question is, what are the conditions that enable us to show up fully and bring our respective strengths and gifts to leadership? I think before making this transition, I personally held this myth that in order to do the things that I love, in order to take on leadership roles that I love, I also would have to take on leadership roles that actually drain me and that I hate. And the opportunity here in expanding and distributing leadership is I'm constantly surprised that there are people who love the things that I hate to do and people who hate the things that I love to do. And it's just like, I don't know. It's like that. It's like a constant revelation when that happens. I think that's another piece that's been really joyful. And the question that's coming up for us is how do we retrain ourselves or remember how to do that and communicate really honestly about what's joyful with each other and trust that it's gonna balance out in some way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Alyssa, do you want to take number 2?
Sure. I'm reading number 2. Yeah, I think some of the ways that leadership advances, sharing leadership advances generative tension is diving into those points that Natalie mentioned, right? So we're trying to prefigure the world we want, if you will, in the husk of the world we're in, right? As things are decaying, falling apart, being reformed, what have you, in some ways. So there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of points of tension that are tensions that are not necessarily going to go away. So we get to be creative with how we approach them. But that creativity requires us to have brave conversations, to talk about things like how the chrysalis was going to be compensated and include them in that process and actually ask them if they wanted us to make a decision so that they didn't have to do that work together, or if they wanted to take the work and figure it out amongst themselves without Mark and I. Right? So they were really generative opportunities that were presented by sharing leadership. So that's just one, and I'll pause, see if anyone wants to add anything.
Mark, anything to add there? Or sorry.
That was a head shake, no.
Okay. Okay.
Watching time.
Right. And, part of this is an old adage, but part of what I hear you saying, and it's an extension of the fractal idea, Alyssa, is that is not the work. So I think people are like, well, wait, but when do you do the work? And part of what I'm hearing you say is that is the work. and solving things like that for now allow you to solve other things for now, right? And so it's not the, it makes it, if you talk about something arcane, this is not the administrative work, right? It's not the overhead of the organization, right? That's how outdated those modes are, right? In terms of thinking about why we do the work and what we're practicing and learning from all of these different spaces, right?
Yeah, just quickly, the founder of Aikido just once said that the further you progress, the fewer teachers there are. And, we're trying to do things in a structure that are not common within this structure. So one of our teachers is our own experience as we try to support organizations and networks and movements who are also trying to figure out leadership and sharing power, as well as nature and art and artists, as well as books and academia. Like, that doesn't go out the window. But that's just one of many other sources of our learning that's also the work.
Thank you for that. So Tim and Lauren, this is a chance to talk about this first resource that you're sharing with the group. And again, you're going to get these slides and the recording, so this will all be live for you. But in a minute, Tim and Lauren, what is Work Shouldn't Suck?
Work Should Suck is a repository and our sort of our consulting arm, but it has a really deep resource around shared leadership, around our anti-racism journey, around alignment, accountability, and transparency. And so the resources on the shared leadership tab include those pieces I mentioned before with our board that they wrote. I know a number of people have been asking for different resources to read. I took a Think Week where I just spent time reading and processing shared leadership material. And I have a post there that lists everything that I read. So if you're really interested in going deep, there's a lot of stuff there. I don't think there's the resource. The Hewlett Foundation did some research in distributed leadership. So if it's not there and you're interested in that, just Google Hewlett Foundation distributed leadership. They also include a tool that says, is your organization ready for shared or distributed leadership? And so there's, I believe, 6 organizations that each adopt distributed leadership in different ways. But if you're looking for more of the how, we also include posts about how we make decisions, what that looks like, and how often we meet and how we evaluate the team. So this is, I guess, the start of a deep dive. If you have a thirst for shared leadership, you could go there.
Great. Mark, what are we looking here in these 4 resources? Are these all on your website? Is that changeelemental.org?
I believe they are all on the website.
Great.
Yep.
So these are all blogs and articles that you've been so generous in writing about your experience as it unfolds. So the dynamism is captured, and I've used all of these in my own teaching. So thank you, Change Elemental, for the degree of writing and co-authorship you've done around this experience. And I want to thank you all. There are a number of questions about transition, which makes me want to do a whole nother session about how the 2 people left at Fractured Atlas and what will happen when the next person leaves at Change Elemental. So I'm already envisioning a follow-up about how do we do transition in non-traditional ways. But I want to thank all 5 of you for just being such fun co-creators on this and for sharing your experience as it unfolds. So here comes the 3-minute pop-up feedback form that we're so grateful for you completing. And thank you all for being here and for your great questions. We'll see you next time.